Thank you, Nathan, and welcome to all of you. And welcome, dear friend David Hartsough. We are very honored to have you present here today. I remember so well, way back in the 1990s, becoming involved with peace and racial justice work. It was a short time until I met up with many Quaker friends. We worked together so well. The many meetings at the Friends Meeting House on 9th Street. And likewise, the Quakers coming to our Unitarian Universalist Society to plan and train for civil disobedience actions during the war years. From protesting American involvement in Central America, and then in 2003, condemning our country's bombing of Iraq. David, you were a very persuasive and important leader. You were a great influence and gave us all courage. So many of us, Vets for Peace, a whole bunch of us, wonderful groups. We'd often end up lying down outside or inside the old federal building, upsetting the police trying to manage us, and many times in the middle of Market Street. Actually, now in retrospect, I believe these are some of our fondest memories of very inspiring times. But now, David, we want to hear your story. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dolores, and thank you all of you for joining us today. I have written a book called Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist, and in it I chronicle my life story, which has been practicing nonviolence and challenging injustice and violence and war nonviolently. And in Gandhi's words, doing experiments with truth. And it's been a joy. And going to jail with you, Dolores, and so many other friends, many, many times at the federal building and on Market Street and at Livermore Labs and at Concord Naval Weapons Station and so many other places. To me, there's no more meaningful place than to be putting my my beliefs into action. Sorry, my hearing aid is singing. So Dolores asked me to say a little bit how in the world how was I brought up to want to spend my life working for peace and justice. And so I'll say a few words about that. My dad was a congregational pastor in the Midwest, in Ohio and Iowa, and supported conscientious objectors during the Second World War and refused to become a chaplain in the military. And this was not too popular among many congregations in the Midwest. So for my first 5 or 6 years, we moved almost every year, while the congregations looked for a more red-blooded pastor. I say to people that I chose my parents well. I can't imagine more loving parents, more parents that really believed and trusted and just their whole lives were loving other people. And our home was always a place that was open to strangers, to friends. In Ohio, we lived right next to a railroad track, and that was when there were many people who were homeless just riding the trains. And the church parsonage was right next to the train tracks. And these folks knew that if they stopped at this home next to the church, they could get some soup and bread. And so that was the way our home was from the very beginning. And then my dad I always thought gave excellent, powerful sermons. He one of them he gave very, very often was loving your neighbor and loving your enemy. And one day I was walking through the park in the winter back to my home for lunch. And here these guys started throwing ice balls at me, including at my face. And I started bleeding a bit. And I remember back to the sermon that my dad had given about loving your enemies. And I thought, well, I don't know if these guys are my enemies, but I should try that out. I should try to love them. So ice balls were coming at me. And I just said, I don't have anything against you guys. I'd like to be your friend. And after a while, they stopped throwing ice balls. It wasn't too much fun throwing ice balls at this guy that says, I'd just like to be your friend. And then when I was 8 years old, just after the first war in Israel, Palestine, when there was hundreds of thousands of refugees, the Quakers asked my dad, together with the United Nations, to come and spend 9 months working with the refugees in Gaza. And my dad had given a lot of sermons on the Good Samaritan, who was my neighbor. But he'd never been outside the United States. And he just decided, well, here are all these refugees that have no tent, no medicine, no food, no water, and decided, together with the support from our family and our church, to leave for 9 months, to go and was in charge of one of the refugee camps. And he was taking food and medicine and tents through the battle lines with soldiers with guns at the ready. And this was a tremendous example to me. Here is a person that not only gave good sermons, but he actually put into practice the things he believed. And here are these people who had never met. He was treating as a child of God, and they were hungry, and he had to do what he could to try to help them, even if it was at risk of his own life. And so that was a tremendous example for me. And after my dad came back from Gaza and also working in Israel, working with refugees there, Quakers offered him a job working with the American Friends Service Committee, and was speaking at colleges and churches all over the East Coast. And he would often take amazing people like A.J. Muste and Bayard Rustin and Ralph Abernathy, who was working with Martin Luther King in Montgomery, on speaking tours. And then he would bring them home to our home afterward. And so just getting to know these, what I call spiritual giants, was just such an inspiration. I credit my dad with introducing me to all these amazing people that are and have been role models all my life. Ralph Abernathy stayed in our home and said this is the first white home that he had ever slept in. And said to my dad, Ray, why don't you bring the boys down to Montgomery? We have the Montgomery bus boycott going down there. And so during spring vacation of 1956, Dad and my brother and I went to Montgomery, Alabama, and spent a couple of weeks of our spring vacation. And it was an experience of a lifetime. Here, the African-American people of Montgomery were refusing to ride the buses. We're getting up an hour earlier to walk to work. and getting home an hour earlier in the afternoon. And even when the black churches were bombed, we're not saying, okay, let's go and bomb some white churches. But they were saying, you know, we're committed to the way of nonviolence. We're going to keep struggling for justice, but we're going to do this nonviolently and peacefully. And meeting Martin Luther King and others that were actively involved in that movement was just also a great inspiration to me. Sherry, I think we can begin the slides. It's interesting, the golden rule, which was a 30-foot catch that was heading for the nuclear testing area. That's the end, that's not the beginning. Sherry. We're headed for the nuclear testing area, and each of them wrote a statement about why they were risking their life to try to stop nuclear weapons testing and the nuclear arms race. And that was super amazing to me. I was 17 years old at the time. Here were these people that realized that this nuclear arms race that we're in the middle of, they couldn't just sit on the sidelines and say, well, I hope the war doesn't come. And especially when they discovered that these nuclear bomb tests were actually killing the people in the South Pacific at that moment. And the golden rule, by the way, is sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge on the way back from Hawaii on, I think, Monday or maybe Tuesday this week. And we'll be here for the summer. And it's continuing its effort to try to stop the nuclear arms race. So I hope you have a chance to meet it. Well, inspired by the golden rule and those people that were on the boat, I decided to help organize a walk from Philadelphia to the United Nations, calling for all nations to stop nuclear bomb testing. That's me with the Walk for Peace sign. And I recruited a number of people from my school. And when we got to to New York, we had 500 of us walking down the street, singing. I forget which song it was now, but this was the largest demonstration. We had 20 or 25 people most of the way, and to have 500 people on this over a couple blocks in New York City walking to the United Nations was a powerful example for me. Next. Well, I was partly inspired by my time in Montgomery and by meeting Bayard Rustin, an African-American Quaker. I decided to go to Howard University. And when 4 students, African-American students down in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided they had had it with segregation. At that time in the South, not only lunch counters, parks, water fountains, bathrooms, motels, everything was segregated. Blacks would have to go in the back door of a eating facility and then sit in the back rather than eat as first-class citizens. Well, these 4 students decided to go to a Woolworth's drugstore to get something to eat. And instead of getting something to eat, they were arrested. And then other students started doing this. It lit a spark all over the South. And within a week, by that weekend, at Howard University, we were picketing Woolworths. And within a couple of weeks, we'd done research, and although drugstores were open to everyone in Washington, D.C. from struggles several years earlier, Maryland and Virginia were still totally segregated. even UN ambassadors could not get something to eat along the highway between the UN and Washington, D.C., or stay in motels. So we got some nonviolent training and started going to drugstores in Maryland to get something to eat. Like the students in Greensboro, instead of getting something to eat, we were thrown in jail and spent the weekends not feeling sorry for ourselves, but singing freedom songs and building community and inspiring one another that, you know, together students are doing this all over the country and we can change this country. Well, the state of Virginia had passed a law saying anybody in Virginia that challenged the law could get 6 months in jail and a $500 fine. And so that whole spring we kept going to Maryland. But after our exams in June of 1960, we got additional nonviolent training and did role playing because the American Nazi Party was down there threatening to kill anybody that challenged segregation there. And went to a People's Drugstore, and here we are, waiting for something to eat. And the owner of the store apparently did not want the publicity and decided not to arrest us, but he also wasn't going to feed us, give us anything to eat. So we sat there for 2 days, and it was the most challenging 2 days of my life. We people spat at us in the face. They put lit cigarettes down our shirts. They punched us in the stomach so hard we would fall on the floor. The American Nazi Party did come with their swastikas. And anyway, we got a lot of practice trying to be nonviolent to people that were pretty hateful and pretty racist. Well, toward the end of the second day, I was meditating on loving your enemy. And I heard this guy come up from behind me and said, if you don't get out of this store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart. And in his hand was a switchblade. And when I looked, the switchblade was a ½ inch or so from my heart. And I had 2 seconds to decide, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there a better way to try to deal with this guy with so much hatred? And I just looked, we'd had a lot of practice, and I looked him in the eye and I said, friend, do what you believe is right, but we'll still try to love you. And amazingly, this face that was contorted with hatred, his jaw began to drop and his knife began to fall and he left the store. Well, at age, whatever I was, 19 at that time, it was a tremendous example of the power of nonviolence. Somehow it was more powerful than the hatred in this guy with a switchblade or with any other people that we dealt with those 2 days. Well, some friendly media people got us out alive there that night. We'd written a statement appealing to the religious and community leaders of Arlington to use their influence to get the eating facilities open to everyone. And we said, if nothing changes, we'll be back in a week. And that was the hard part. We'll be back in a week. And we went back to Howard and essentially shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. On the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met with the business leaders, and it got a commitment to open the eating facilities to everyone within 10 days. And that was maybe the most important lesson of my life, that when something terrible is happening, you don't have to just curse the television set or the president or racism or segregation or wars. Find some people that believe as deeply as you do about that issue, get some nonviolence training, and go and challenge that injustice, and sustain that commitment to challenge that injustice until something changes. So that was probably more important than anything else I learned in high school or college, or maybe ever since. So that's been my life, pursuing that lesson that I learned back in 1960. Next. Sherry? So anyway, I'll go on to the next story.
I hear you, David. Just a second. It's not moving.
That's okay. Instead of getting 6 months in jail, I actually got a scholarship to go to Europe with the experiment in international living. First to Yugoslavia, and then studied in Berlin for a year at the two universities of East and West Berlin. And this was at the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were threatening nuclear war with each other, were threatening war over Berlin. And it was pretty intense. And I was riding my bike across Checkpoint Charlie over to East Berlin to the university there where I was studying in the mornings, and would hear a lot of communist propaganda. And I would challenge some of that propaganda, and they would call me a capitalist warmonger. I would go back to the West Berlin in the afternoon and hear a lot of anti-communist propaganda and challenge that, and they called me a communist conspirator. And I kind of, that was a lesson very early on. Here in the East and the West, where we have, on both sides, we've been taught to believe we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And we're even willing to threaten nuclear war to kill the bad guys, not realizing that probably we're going to die also in trying to get the bad guys. I did small things like bringing students from East and West Berlin together just to get to know each other. This photo here is Checkpoint Charlie, where the American tanks, the American tanks, that picture was the right one. We're facing east, and the Soviet tanks were on the other side facing west, ready to start a nuclear war. That's where I biked through every morning and afternoon, going back and forth to the two universities. Next. Well, I went back after the wall came down in '89, which was 18 years later. And here, no, back.
Oh, sorry, David. I don't know what's going on.
And here, instead of tanks facing each other, was this massive mural of Gandhi on the top and Walesa on the bottom, and it was pointing to a museum just half a block down the street on the history of nonviolent struggle for human rights around the world. And I thought, what a beautiful transformation from a place where we're threatening nuclear war with each other to really celebrating the power of nonviolent struggle to create human rights and justice and peace in the world. Next. Well, from Berlin, I heard that you could go camping in the Soviet Union, of all places. I mean, these were the ultimate enemy that we were ready to wipe off the map of the world. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm gonna get some other students and get a VW bug, and we traveled 5,000 miles through the Soviet Union, just getting to know the Russian people and having them a chance to get to know us. And if you look closely at these faces, this is in one of the campgrounds, you can tell these are all evil communists. And no wonder we were ready to kill all of them if necessary for our quote security. Next. Well, I ended up taking 3 different student groups to the Soviet Union in the early 60s. This was in 1962, the next summer, where we had 18 students, and just again getting to know people in their homes and schools and churches, trying to build peace from the bottom up. If our governments were not willing to make peace, at least hopefully we could make some peace from the bottom up. Well, I'd been arrested at a prayer and conscience vigil in front of the White House for praying for an end to nuclear bomb testing. And the Americans all came up and said, "Oh, why are you demonstrating against our peaceful bombs? Why don't you go and demonstrate in Russia?" And later that summer, I was in Red Square, and we decided to make a sign that said the same thing, which was bomb tests kill people, and just stood in silence in front of the Kremlin there. And again, the Russians, like the Americans, came up and said, "Why are you demonstrating against our peaceful bombs? We weren't prepared for a war back in 1941, and we lost 20 million people. We're not going to allow that to happen again. Go home and demonstrate in the United States. That's where you need it." And we said, "Well, we did demonstrate in the United States," and they said to go to Russia. Well, some police came up and threatened us with 20 years in prison if we didn't stop demonstrating against their peaceful bombs. And we said, "Thank you for warning us, but if these bombs reach their destination, if we ended up having a nuclear war, it's going to be much worse than 20 years in prison." And they said, "Well, we have to go and talk with our superiors," and they left and never came back. So I'm happy to say we didn't have to spend 20 years in prison. Next. Also in 1962, I'm the young guy there in the back, dark hair. I was one of 6 Quakers that got to spend about 40 minutes with President Kennedy. We'd had a conference that weekend on ending nuclear war, and invited Kennedy to come and speak to the conference. And he declined, but said, "Oh, I'll be happy to talk to a delegation of Quakers that come and visit me in the White House." So we had about 40 minutes encouraging him to take leadership to try to get us out of this nuclear morass where we're threatening each other with nuclear war. Encouraging him to give food to the Chinese who were just dying of starvation. He says, "You mean feeding the enemy?" We were just sitting with him in his rocking chair and us in a semicircle, and we were amazed how he was listening to us. He was not like he was the president of the United States, telling these crazy Quakers what to do. Well, he said to us, "I've been reading the Guns of August, how before the First World War, everyone was arming to the teeth to try to prevent that war." And that was exactly what got them into that war. And he said, it's scary how similar the situation was then to what it is right now. This is 1962. Well, we encouraged him to challenge the Russians to a peace race and to stop our nuclear bombs testing. And his secretary came in and said, "Mr. President, your next appointment is here." And he said, "Tell them to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers." So unfortunately, I'm the only one of those 6 that are still alive. And Kennedy also said to us, "If you want me to take this kind of leadership to move us in a direction of peace, you're going to have to build a much more powerful movement to help encourage me to take that kind of leadership. The military industrial complex is very strong, and I have to buck that. And actually, within a year, Kennedy did exactly what we were encouraging him to do. He challenged the Russians in a peace race. He unilaterally stopped our nuclear bomb tests. He took a number of steps which were contrary to what the CIA and the FBI and all his nuclear security staff were encouraging him to do. So next, I'm going to try to be a little faster. During the Vietnam War, a bunch of us Quakers began reading the names of the war dead on the Capitol steps at Wednesday at noontime. And each Wednesday, we would get through 30 or 40 names, and they would arrest us and take us off to jail. Well, after this went on for 3 weeks, I think it was, I was working with the Friends Committee on National Legislation as a lobbyist to end the war at the time. I went to Congressman George Brown and I said, Congressman, they're arresting us every week just for reading the names of war dead on the Capitol steps. Is there anything you can do to support us? And he said, yes, I think I'll join you. And I will also write to every member of Congress, inviting them to join me and joining you tomorrow. So he wrote a letter that evening to all members of Congress. And the next day, when we were out there to start reading the names of the war dead, 3 members of Congress, including George Brown, who was standing there, joined us. And when we were all arrested, the Quakers, for reading the names of the war dead, the congressman had congressional immunity and continued reading the names of 40,000 Americans who had been killed. And that continued week after week, and more and more members of Congress began joining us. That was all the names were put in the congressional record, and within a week, peace people all over the country were reading the names of war dead at their federal buildings, at post offices, at their local congressperson's office. And Life magazine did actually a special with the photo and the kind of life story of every person, every American who had been killed in that war just in that last month. So I like to think that our courage gave courage to the congressmen to do what they believed was right. Their courage gave courage or excuse to the media to do what they knew was right. And that gave people all across the country courage to actually begin doing something in their own communities, to begin calling national attention to this madness that we were committing in Vietnam. Next. Quakers, about 250 of us, went to the White House to pray for peace. And we're all warned after a short time, and we were all silent worship. We're having a silent worship in front of the White House. The 250 other Quakers were all arrested. And Jan and I and our 2 young children, that's Heidi, and then our son Peter, who was about 2 years old, was behind the police chief here. They didn't arrest us. They apparently didn't think it was great publicity to kill this young couple and their children. So the chief of police came up and was trying to encourage us to leave. And he said, you know, if you're arrested, your children are going to be taken away and they'll be put in juvenile hall. And you know what happens to children there. And we said, yes, of course we love our children, but we also love the children in Vietnam. And all we're doing here is praying for an end to this slaughter of innocent civilians and children and babies in Vietnam. Well, he kept, for about half an hour, he kept trying to convince us to leave. And finally, we said, well, if you arrest us, we will walk to the police car. So that was the way we resolved that problem. But somehow the four of us sitting there in silence in front of the White House caught the attention of the media more than the 250 other Quakers who'd been already arrested. And this photo was in all the papers all across the country. It went out with the Associated Press photo, I guess. So our friends all around the country sent us this photo from the front page of their papers. And it's now in our children's baby books. But I think a lot of people, after their kind of teenage idealistic years and maybe get married, think, well, we better give up some of our idealism and adjust to the real world. And well, we never quite got that idea. It seemed to us we're citizens of this world, we're children of God, and if our brothers and sisters are getting killed by our bombs and our tax dollars, another part of the world, somehow we've got to speak out to stop that. We cannot remain silent. Next. Well, this is 1970, Christmas of 1971. When up to that point, the United States had been bombing rice paddies and the Ho Chi Minh Trail and lots of places in North Vietnam, but had not yet started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. And at Christmas time in 1971, the US started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, where literally millions of people were living, mostly civilians, of course. And we were living with Dick and Phyllis Taylor that are here with us today. And we called a worship service at the Life Center community where we were living. And during that worship service, tried to just imagine what it was like for the families and the people living under those bombs in Hanoi and Haiphong. And feeling that pain and that suffering, and the children not knowing, are they going to have parents tomorrow morning? The parents not knowing if their children will still be alive or whether they'll have a home. And then we tried to look at what are we being called to do to try to stop this madness. And somehow, and it was partly because we were living in a community, we made the decision, somehow we're going to put our bodies between the bombs and the people that are getting killed in Vietnam and Hanoi and Haiphong. And discovered that there was a Navy weapons station in Leonardo, New Jersey, not about an hour and a half from Philadelphia where we were living, and found people with 22 canoes and people who were willing to actually block this armed ship. It was called the USS Nitro, literally putting our bodies between the bombs and the people of Vietnam. And for 6 days, actually did maneuvers trying to stay in front of that ship. And we had met some of the sailors and who were not too happy about being on that ship that was loaded to the gills, way up high on the decks with munitions. And we're not happy about being a part of this war. But they warned us that at 6 o'clock the next morning, it was going to be leaving for Vietnam. So we were out there very early that morning with our canoes. And lo and behold, as the ship lifted anchor, and we saw all these sailors kind of giving us the V sign. All of a sudden, we saw 7 of the sailors jumping off of the bow of the ship into the water and starting to swim toward our canoes. And it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. They were actually trying to join our peace flotilla, saying no to this madness of shipping bombs off to Vietnam. Well, they were picked up by the Coast Guard, put back in the ship and put in the brig of the ship. But word went out around to the Navy around the world and through the news about Americans putting their lives on the line to try to stop these arms from going to Vietnam. And those sailors told us later that when their ship went through the Panama Canal, the other ships had all heard about the 7 sailors on the USS Nitro and gave them the fist of solidarity. And about that time, the resistance to that war among the military actually increased significantly. This blockade went from Leonardo, went up and down the East Coast and then to the West Coast. And when we blocked the USS America, an aircraft carrier down in Virginia, 50 of the sailors went AWOL, within an hour before the ship was leaving for Vietnam. So I'd like to think, and if you've seen Sir No Sir, you see that one of the main reasons that war ended was that the American soldiers were not willing to follow their orders. So I like to think that our courage gave courage to these soldiers, these sailors, to do what they believed was right, and their courage gave courage to a whole lot of other soldiers to say, we can no longer participate in what we believe is immoral and wrong. Next. This is the aircraft carrier that we're also blocking. And here they actually, with grappling hooks, turned upside down all of our canoes, and then put us on the Navy boat, a small Navy boat, and with us face down on the decks, with the soldiers at gunpoint at us, while the aircraft carrier sailed off for Vietnam. Next. Well, closer to home, we have the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Labs, which is one of the 2 laboratories under the name of the University of California that have developed all of our nuclear bombs, including the hydrogen bomb. Since 1981, people in the religious community and many others have been out there every Good Friday and on Hiroshima Day. And actually there's an ongoing campaign by Tri-Valley Cares, which is working with people in that community day after day after day, saying we cannot be silent when we are developing these bombs. Of course, now we're spending, I think it's many billions of dollars modernizing these nuclear weapons, even that we have now. And we know that if there's even a smaller nuclear war, there could be nuclear winter. And Dan Ellsberg points out that if we have nuclear winter as a result of nuclear war, within 9 months, there will be no crops growing because there will be no sunshine. And we'll have mass starvation. Billions of people will have already died in the war, but the rest of the people in the world will die of starvation. And I just cannot understand how we as American people not only are allowing this madness to continue, but how we're risking the lives of all human life on our planet because we don't like the Russians or we don't like the Chinese, or somehow we think that being willing to bomb and kill millions of people on the other side is going to get us security. After 9/11, I wrote a letter which got published in the Washington Post, in which I said, the trillions of dollars that we've spent on intelligence and security got us zero security on 9/11. How about if we try something else? How about if we tried to say, we'd like to be friends with people all over the world? Instead of spending all this money on war, 4% of what we're spending on the military could end starvation in the whole world. We could send hundreds of thousands of Peace Corps people and build medical clinics all over the world. And, you know, we could be the most loved nation in the world instead of often the most hated. So, but at any rate, many of us in the religious community and others with the concern about this issue, and especially for those of us that live in the Bay Area, it's what, 35 miles away. We cannot be silent when this madness continues. Next. Well, as if that was not bad enough, Concord Naval Weapons Station, where 80% of the weapons that we sent to Vietnam, the United States, I should say, not we, again in the 80s was sending arms to Central America to fund those wars. And together with Vietnam vets, including Brian Wilson, who had experienced the horrors of the war in Vietnam, and then had gone to Nicaragua and saw again in El Salvador how we were doing the same thing again. And Brian came back and said, David, we've got to do something much, much more than write letters to our Congress people. And somehow we've got to stop this madness. So we discovered that every week, or every day really, truckloads and train loads of bombs were being taken from Concord Naval Weapons Station down this highway across the public road, and the train tracks also across the public road to be loaded on the ships to go to Central America. So we decided to start what we called Nuremberg actions, which were based on the Nuremberg principles after the Second World War, which talked about it's against international law to kill innocent civilians in time of war. And that's exactly what we're doing in Central America. So we felt we were upholding international law by blocking these trains and trucks. This is Dorothy Granada and me at the beginning of that action, blocking this munitions truck that was carrying munitions. And each train or truckload had explosives on the side of the truck, so you could actually know what was in it. Next. Well, Brian Wilson, who, as I said, was a Vietnam vet, who had gone to Central America and experienced the horror of those wars, decided to start a 40-day fast on the tracks. And he wrote to the Navy saying, the 10 or 15 of us, Vietnam veterans, are going, starting September 1st of 1987, will be on the tracks, saying to the U.S. military, we cannot be silent when this is continuing in our name. And you, the government, have three choices. You can stop the death trains and say, well, we agree with you. It's immoral to be killing civilians in Latin America. Or you can arrest us, take us off to jail, but we want you to know that as soon as we're released, we'll be back on the tracks. Or third, you can run over us and get your munitions through to the ships and head them to Vietnam. Well, we never guessed that they would choose the third to run over us. And here is Brian lying on the tracks after the train. This is the train with munitions. I guess you can't see that, but in the background on the tracks, after it has run over him, it had 2 box cars of munitions. And Brian has lost his 2 legs. He had a big hole in his head. He was blood all over, and I am there trying to hold the blood in his head. Well, this was the most horrible experience of my life. Luckily, Brian lived, and instead of saying yes, U.S. government, you're right. There's nothing that we can do to stop this madness. For 2.5 years, we blocked every train at Concord Naval Weapons Station. And people even slept on the tracks to make sure they didn't sneak through the trains at night. And sometimes they would have to arrest 2 busloads of people before they could get the trains through to take the munitions out to the ships and onto Central America. So it was people over the world heard about this and were so inspired that here Brian Wilson and others in the United States felt their pain and their suffering so much that we're willing to risk our lives to try to stop that inflicting pain and suffering on people in other parts of the world in these war zones. Next. At Concord, we had about 25 different churches and religious groups, community groups, war tax resistors that would come once a month to join us at the vigil at the tracks and to block trains and trucks. This is my mom and dad who came down with a group from Sonoma County. And I'm happy to say that with my bad example, my mom and dad were arrested with us at Concord Naval Weapons Station. This was taken just before we were arrested one day at the tracks. And you notice my dad's very radical sign, love one another. And I think if we take that seriously, it's a pretty big commitment, and it's a dangerous commitment. It can be a dangerous commitment, and I'm happy to say that it was so good to experience that together as a family. There's lots of stories I could tell, but we better keep going. Next, that's the Philippines, where with U.S. bombs, this is 1989. The military was bombing the people of Negro. It was an area the size of Rhode Island. And well, it's a long story, but people had fled to church halls outside the bombing area, and there were 500 people with what they could carry, which is their children and their, some food, away from the bombing area into these church halls. And here the death squads came and threatened these 500 people with being killed if they didn't leave immediately. We heard about this. I was there with the invitation of the Philippine Council of Churches. And we, with the invitation of the Catholic bishop there, we got a group of 25 international religious people to go to that church hall and said to the death squads, these are our brothers and sisters. We're imploring you not to go ahead with your threat to kill these people. They're also children of God, and we want you to know that we're going to be here with them. And luckily, the death squads decided not to continue with their threats. Next. And later, these people went home and started peace communities, which calling on arm folks on both sides not to do shooting and bombing in their neighborhood. I'm just going to go very quickly through these. This is actually in Moscow in 1991, where the right-wing communists, the CIA, their CIA and the KGB, etc., arrested Gorbachev because they didn't like his peace overtures to the West and, uh, stopping the human rights violations, etc. And then threatened to arrest Yeltsin, who was the elected president of Russia. And the Russian people, 10,000 of them, surrounded the White House, which was their parliament building where Yeltsin was. And when the tanks and the bombing planes came to bomb, they had orders to bomb the parliament building, and the tanks to come and shoot, at the building and the people inside it. These 10,000 people for 3 days and nights were out there defending it and offering food and something to drink to the soldiers in the tanks. And within 3 days, that coup had been defeated by nonviolent people just refusing the orders to obey. And that was one of the many experiences I've had. Actually, Dick Taylor, who again is here with us, wrote the training guide. These 10,000 people, the living ring they called themselves, asked for us to come back and do nonviolent training to try to prevent future coups d'etats. And that training manual was actually that Dick wrote, was also used in preparing people for how to react to the coup d'etat, which we almost had this last election in the United States. Next. There's not time for all the stories, but this is in Kosovo, where there was a powerful nonviolent movement. This was 10,000 students marching peacefully for a right to go back to their university, because they were Kosovars rather than Serbs, were kicked out of the university, and all the books in the Kosovo language were burned. They were peacefully marching, and it was very similar to what happened in Selma. All of a sudden, there were police stopping them, and then ran into them with the horses, and so very similar to what happened in Selma. But so we were there as a small group of people to try to support that nonviolent movement, and the U.S. government and the Western European countries essentially ignored that nonviolent movement. But then when the armed group formed to try to fight the Serbian repression, the US CIA came to their aid, and as you know, not only gave military assistance, et cetera, but then bombed Kosovo and Serbia for, I think it was 60 days. But I feel very strongly that if we had supported that nonviolent movement, that transition to a more just and peaceful society could have been peaceful instead of all the killing and the hatred that will continue between those different groups for generations. Next. I keep saying I've got to quit, but this is Mel Duncan and I, who were the co-founders of the Nonviolent Peace Force, and inspired by Witness for Peace and Peace Brigades International and our work in Central America and other places, we felt there needs to be thousands of trained people that can go into conflict areas to help protect civilians and protect the local peace and justice workers. And so that was our inspiration back in 1999 to try to start the Nonviolent Peace Force, which now has hundreds of trained nonviolent peacekeepers from all parts of the world in working in many conflicts around the world. And even the United Nations is now recognizing the importance and the power of nonviolent peacekeeping as opposed to armed peacekeeping or armed intervention. But you can look up nonviolentpeaceforce.org if you want to learn more. Next. Next, this was Nonviolent Peace Force at work in Sri Lanka. I've also led 3 delegations to Iran during the George W. Bush years and also the Trump years when we were threatening war with Iran. And it was very similar to the 1960s going to Russia. Here, our sanctions and our threatened war is going to kill thousands or millions of people who have nothing against us. But, you know, somehow we don't like their government. And both George W. Bush and Trump were threatening war. You see, the one has a button, war is not the answer. Well, that's what they very deeply believe. And I think that's what people all over the world believe, is that war is not creating any security for anybody. And especially in the age of nuclear war, we will all lose. But anyway, again, like in Russia in the 60s, through these delegations to Iran, we're trying to build peace from the bottom up. And actually on this last delegation, got to spend an hour and a half with their foreign, it's like their Secretary of State who had negotiated the nuclear arms deal. And obviously what needs to happen right now is the United States should sign that deal, which had been laboriously worked out back, you know, under the Obama administration. Then Trump resigned, you know, took the United States out of it. And we just need to go back to that. That's the greatest way to stop all the economic sanctions that are killing the people. And I learned firsthand, I had a heart attack there, and Kaiser was not allowed to send any money to help me get medical care because of the economic sanctions. We don't care about the people. And somehow, I don't think that's really what the American people want. Next. Here, I don't know, can you see this? This is, I don't know if you can see from my screen, but that's Loris sitting up here. And here, each March 19th, I think it was, for 10 years or so, we had the die-ins on Market Street in San Francisco, in which we were saying, this is madness what the United States is doing, bombing and all the sanctions and killing the people of Iraq because we don't like their dictator, you know. But there's certain, anyway, I think many of you know that for 2 days when that shock and awe war started, non-violently committed people shut down the financial district for, I think it was 2 days. But then we did these die-ins every year for probably 10 years. Next. And the US has 800 military bases all around the world, supposedly to keep the peace, but in fact are part of our planned getting ready for nuclear war with China and or Russia. And there are groups that really know, including people like Michael Clare and the Union of Concerned Scientists, et cetera, that say we are closer to nuclear war with China and or Russia now than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And these are local people for over 2.5 years, every day have blocked the entrance to where they're building this military base, which it's part of encircling China. This is in Jeju Island in South Korea. And they would have a Catholic mass every day at this entrance where they'd get arrested during the Catholic mass. and over and over and over going to jail. And somehow this whole idea of 800 military bases preparing for wars with countries and actually having our troops and tanks and aircraft carriers at the ready is not going to get us or anybody else security. But these people are doing this partly because it's destroying their livelihood and their community, but also they realize they will be a target if there's nuclear war. Next. Let's go ahead, next. Our government is now resorting to drone warfare, where it's the ideal kind of war where no Americans will have to die. The American soldiers can sit at their computers in Nevada or anywhere else in the United States and push a button, and bombs will be dropped on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Pakistan, on Libya, anywhere else we like. And so there's people from California and people from around the country that have been demonstrating on a sustained basis to stop this drone warfare. The idea that this is, I think, part of what our government learned from Vietnam is having thousands of American soldiers coming home from the wars is it's not going to promote the good feeling that we have about wars. So here, Jan and I, my wife, are with 3 others blocking a drone base up in Beale Air Force Base north of Sacramento. And of course, others are welcome to join us. Next. This is the last photo I'll be showing. This was the vigil at Fort Detrick, which was building or developing biological warfare, germ warfare in Frederick, Maryland, not far from Washington, D.C. And my mom, who's in the white there, the white dress, and she was a school teacher, and she would go in her spring vacations or summer vacations to be a part of this vigil, which lasted over 2 years. And people just stood in silence, calling for this base to be converted into a World Health Center, where we would try to find the cure to things like the COVID pandemic, rather than making germ warfare, which 2.5 ounces of this Q fever that they were making could kill everybody in the world if distributed around the world. Well, my folks, or my mom was there every summer, and all the workers had orders to just drive straight ahead into the base, not to take leaflets, not to talk to these people. Well, and it was a little discouraged sometimes. It was very hot in the summer, it was cold in the winter. My folks moved to Salem, Oregon, and 10 years later, a man came up to my mom in the bookstore and said, "Were you in that vigil at Fort Detrick 10 years ago?" And Mom said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I want you to know that it was because of you folks that I resigned my job from working there." And here, 10 years later, 2,500 miles away, it was this face that he was not even supposed to have seen 10 years earlier. And I just share that story. Partly it was the courage and the love of my mom to be out there in her summer vacation, but partly we never know what little thing that we might do can impact people far that we might not even have any understanding of. And like our blocking of the trains and the trucks and the trains in Central America and Vietnam inspired a lot of other people. Well, if these people are willing to do this, what are we willing to do? So I have written that book, Waging Peace: Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist, partly to give people hope that there are things that we can do to make a difference. And I think that hope is a absolutely crucial ingredient. If people feel hopeless or so discouraged and do nothing, I think government's going to have us right where they want us. And if the people of the world who increasingly are understanding the power of nonviolent action and are overthrowing dictatorships by nonviolent means, um, we do have the power to make that change if we make that decision, and if we are willing to have the courage and are build the community with others that are going to work together to really create that change. Well, I'm sorry I talked a lot longer than I planned, but let's open it up to discussion, your questions.
Okay. For the first, I think this is the first question from Art Persico. Congratulations on the part you played in influencing President Kennedy and getting him to challenge the Russians to a peace race. We need that again now, but with President Biden, of course. So that's more or less a comment. And then here is something from David Quinley to everyone from Elk Grove, which that's all it says. So that's going to mean something to somebody, but not, that's all it says. Dolores and David, to everyone, the problem with the billions of our tax dollars that fund the US military, which is the largest in the world, is that in our capitalist economy, there are industrialists who will make a tremendous profit off of manufacturing these weapons. So it is precisely a huge money-making project for a few people. How to expose this truth to more Americans and how to stop it.
Well, I think more and more of us are realizing that the problem is that some people are making billions of dollars, and it's mostly corporations are making billions of dollars off of making these weapons, and really everybody is losing. And potentially we can lose everything if we have nuclear war. And so there are efforts organized by World Beyond War, which I co-founded, and Code Pink, and many other groups, to divest any funds, which are churches or universities or even personally have invested in any companies that are making money at the expense of thousands and millions of lives. And that is getting traction. I think there are whole church bodies that are divesting billions of dollars of from their pension funds and that kind of thing. And I would assume Unitarians have already done that. But if they haven't, here's an opportunity. But my personal belief is that the overwhelming majority of people in the world want peace. We don't want war. We don't like the idea of killing people. We don't like to get killed ourselves. And if we have any sense of what war is like, we realize that this is certainly not what we want to be about in the world. And the U.S., of course, is the largest arms seller in the world, and continues to ship $3.8 billion of weapons to Israel, which was just unloading them on Gaza and destroying that society. But it's American money, and it's American tax dollars, and it's American made weapons. And if we did what we did with the South African apartheid, massive worldwide boycott, and divestment and demonstrations and stopping the ships that were unloading cargo from South Africa, etc. If we had global movement of people as determined as we were to help end that apartheid regime in South Africa, we could end war. And I encourage people to look at the World Beyond War website. There are just all, one, people can take a pledge not to engage in or support wars in any way, and to work nonviolently to stop them. But then there's all kinds of campaigns, closing military bases, divestment, etc.
I have
So,
one, I'll stop you there because that's just a huge question.
yes.
You could even blame David and Dolores for throwing that one at you. That was
Okay.
huge, but you did it very well. Very, very well. David, could you comment on Henry David Thoreau's important work, which influenced Gandhi and many others, now called civil disobedience, but originally called the rights and duties of the individual in relation to government and resistance to civil government? If you just comment on what you think about David Thoreau's important work that influenced about civil disobedience and its relationship to the individual, between the individual and the government.
And I see that Henry Thoreau has actually joined our discussion today. Welcome, Henry. Together next to Dolores. But I mean, I think people, Thoreau was obviously a lover of nature. That's where he got his nourishment, which I do too. But he was also a person of conscience. And when the U.S. began the Mexican War, war with Mexico, he refused to pay taxes for it. And luckily for him, he only had to spend one night in jail. But he wrote the Duty of Civil Disobedience, I think it was called. But that influenced Gandhi, influenced King, and I think he was a very important building block in moving toward the understanding around the world of the power of the people to non-violently bring about change, and the importance of each of us to listen to our conscience about what we should be doing with our lives. And speaking of Thoreau, who is known for his war tax resistance, my wife Jan and I and many, many others are refusing to pay 53% of our taxes, which go for wars and preparations for wars every year, and then put that money into groups working for justice and for peace and for what we believe in. I mean, why pray for war and demonstrate for peace, but then pay for war?
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, here's 3 questions from Art. I think it's kind of unfair of Art to do this, but he has done this. 3 questions. What is the most important lesson your activism has taught you? And what would you prioritize right now in 2021 as the most crucial issues or targets for which nonviolent resistance should be used? And the 3rd question is, which existing organizations do you admire because of their nonviolent resistance tactics and the targets they've chosen? So that's the first is your activism lesson. The second is, how would you prioritize the most crucial issues to use nonviolent resistance now? What would be the most crucial way? And what existing organizations do you admire because they're already using nonviolent resistance tactics and targets?
Well, we could spend many hours on those 3 questions.
Right.
But
Feel free to abbreviate.
I think what I shared about our experience in the sit-in in Arlington, Virginia, is maybe the most important lesson that I learned, that when something terrible is happening, you don't have to just curse the television set or the president or segregation. or racism or war, you find some other people that believe as deeply as you do about that, get some nonviolent training, build some sense of community where you're going to really work on this together and support each other rather than as isolated individuals, and go after it on a sustained basis. And we've seen that it does take sustained campaigns. I mean, whether it was on the women's right to vote, on the civil rights bill, on the voting rights bill, on the abolitionist movement. These were all campaigns that continued over months, over years, and we've got to develop that same kind of commitment that empowered the people that were involved in those earlier movements. In terms of what is most important, I mean, personally, I think this danger of nuclear war is is absolutely horrendous and tragic. I mean, the idea that for any purpose in the world, we'd be willing to put an end to human life on this planet. I mean, how could we continue with this somehow misguided, tragic understanding of how to get security? And I mean, even if you had 10 dictators, that were doing horrible things, is that what it is trying to deal with that by bombing them and starting a nuclear war and threatening all life on the planet? Is it worth it? And especially since we have found nonviolent ways to deal with dictators. And Erica Chenoweth, as you probably know, I think this is another very, very important lesson. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan have written the book, Why Civil Resistance Works, where they studied 323 violent and nonviolent movements around the world on very big things, like overthrowing repressive governments, and found that the nonviolent movements were twice as likely to be successful, and twice as likely not to end up in another civil war, and to end up with democratic societies. Well, and people all over the world are discovering that power of people power nonviolence. So we need to do that ourselves. I think here in the United States, police violence to African Americans and people of color is absolutely crucial. And in addition to the kind of movements that we've been developing around the country, which I think it's absolutely crucial that we keep a nonviolent discipline. That if we start having even some violence, this is an excuse to the police and to the powers that be. Well, I mean, they obviously have 1,000 times the number of guns that the people have. So we're just going to have another, all-out war. And I think if you look at the civil rights movement, or as Vincent Harding called it, the freedom movement of the 60s, and the sustained nonviolent struggles that happened in Birmingham and Selma and so many other places, that the people nonviolently going up to register to vote, and instead of getting registered to vote, the police brought out their police dogs, they hit them with the batons, they kicked them down the bottom of the stairs of the courthouse, etc. And people just kept going to register to vote every day. And this was on televisions around the country. And that touched the conscience and hearts of the American people.
Frozen.
And we got a voting rights bill within a couple of months after President Johnson said, well, there's never going to be enough. I mean, wait a few years before you're going to try to do that. But that is the challenge, through a concerted, sustained nonviolent movement, to touch the hearts and the conscience of the American people. And that can be around the nuclear danger. It can be around racism and violence to African American men, etc. And I think the other thing, which is an important part of nonviolent struggle, is to point out positive alternatives. And Eugene, Oregon, 33 years ago, saw that the police were not prepared to deal with with violent conflicts, and started something called cahoots, which I think was like 3% of what had been the police budget, which were people that were trained in de-escalation of conflict, and which were trained in how to deal with people with drug abuse and peaceful ways of trying to deal with conflicts instead of having the gun at the ready. And they have successfully dealt with over 97% of the cases that they've dealt with over the last 33 years.
Mm.
Well, there's no reason in the world that every city and municipality in this country shouldn't do something like that. And that could reduce the shooting of people of color by probably 97%. But so we need to hold up those examples, like cahoots, like what they've done in Eugene, Oregon. And I know that some other cities like Oakland and Washington, D.C. are considering that. But I think we need to hold up those examples of what we do want to do. And what was the third question?
Oh, the third question is, which existing organizations do you admire because of their nonviolent tactics? And you've already mentioned a couple of them.
Well, I'm prejudiced. I helped start World Beyond War and the Nonviolent Peace Force. I think Peace Brigades International, which continues to do really excellent work. A couple of nights ago I think UNHCR, that UN High Commission for Refugees. I mean, there's just millions of refugees all around the world that are suffering. And I think many of the UN agencies, the UNESCO and UNICEF and so forth, are doing great work. I think Training for Change that George Lakey helped start, which is doing training of people that really want to work for transformation of our society and world. Campaign Nonviolence, which Ken Budigan and friends of ours are working on, are certainly doing great work. So I mean, there's lots of good work, good groups that are doing stuff out there. I mean,
I think that's a nice list, and I want to move on to make sure I get everybody in. One person has a very strategic and succinct question: who controls which countries war weapons are sold to by U.S. corporations? In other words,
well, Congress passed a law, I think some years ago, saying we're not going to, we should not give military assistance to governments that are dictatorships or repressing human rights, etc. Well, that's being ignored. But I think it is ultimately up to Congress, and it's up to the president, and ultimately it's up to the American people. I think there's been a movement by Jewish Voice for Peace and others that are saying right now we should stop this 3.8 billion of military assistance to Israel as long as it's either bombing and threatening Palestinians, etc. But I think, and there is legislation, by the way, Poor People's Campaign, let me add the Poor People's Campaign to the list of groups that I think very, very highly of, and they would be actually close to the top of my list, that are working for challenging the triple evils that King talked about: racism, economic injustice, and militarism. And they're trying to build a people power movement to do just that. And I had it right here, but it's disappeared. But there is a resolution that's just been introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal from Seattle, which was penned by the Poor People's Campaign, and I think could have been written by Unitarians and Quakers, and it's calling for a $350 billion cut in the military budget, and putting those funds into what we really need for real security for the American people, and to challenge the racism and. But at any rate,
Well, I'll move you along here.
yes.
That's a pretty good answer, I think. I hope that will satisfy. This is from Larry Danos.
Mhm.
Thanks for being here to share your story or stories and for being part of the UUSF programs for so many years. It's good to see you here today. So
Thank you.
that's from Larry. And then
Well,
this,
that's a very difficult question to answer.
and this is from Carol Cruikshank. I'm sorry to have to leave for another engagement. And then this is a question to everyone that should be helpful to everyone. If people want to see the recording of today, how do they access it? Well, certainly through uusf.org, but I have to defer to somebody else. Dolores, do you know? Do you know where they click on from? If you go to uusf.org, where do you click to get to the YouTube videos that the forum has created?
If they go to YouTube and then type in the search box for UUSF forum, there's a whole section of different videos, and this video for today will be at the top of the list.
Okay, so that's you go directly to
Go to
YouTube.
Right.
And then
And-
from YouTube, you then do a search for uusf.org.
Right.
And then you click on the list of videos. You click on the ones you want to listen to, and this will be at the top of the list.
Right. And if anybody has trouble with that, if there's a problem, you can email forum@uusf.org, and we will return your email with a link to the video. So we'll have it up and running probably by Tuesday, I believe.
And
Okay,
I'd like to just make a plug for my book, Waging Peace, which actually tells many of these stories much more in depth than I could do today. It's available from PM Press, and Dolores has some copies of the book. So
Yeah, I have many copies, so just let me know. Put
you
your,
can get them directly from her.
all right, here are 6 more messages. One is thank you for your compelling presentation and vital work. Code Pink has a website for socially responsible investing at www.codepink.org/webtool. And here's another one. Do you have any do you know of any productive conversations going with the police, or did they basically show their agreement by not arresting you, not showing up? Oh, did you ever have any productive conversations going with the police, or did they basically show their agreement by not arresting or not showing up?
Well, I think in almost every opportunity, every time I've been arrested, which is, I think, over 150 times, I have tried to actually engage in a friendly conversation with the police and treating them as a human being. And I'll just give one example, and I think it was the time that we had the photo there on Market Street with the die-in in San Francisco. I saw that the officer had the name Shahada on his vest, and I said, "Oh, Shahada, that's a very interesting name. Where did you come from, or your family come from?" And he said, "From Palestine." And I said, "Oh, have you ever been back there?" "Oh, yes, and been back there a couple of times." And then I thought about it, and I knew a woman named Emily Shahada, who was a Palestinian Quaker, who had been using humor as a way of trying to tell the story of what was going on over there. And I said, "Are you, by any chance, related to Emily Shahada?" And he said, "Yeah, that's my mother."
Oh, wow, bullseye.
And and we talked some more, and he said, "You know, I bet 80% of the police in San Francisco agree with you folks." You know, so I think policemen are human, just like everybody. And if you treat them with respect and openness, they will often respond in kind. I think it's much more difficult, especially for people of color, who get stopped, in the middle of the night on the street or whatever, and don't even have a chance to try to interact before the guy starts shooting. But that's what I've discovered. I mean,
Okay.
I think I really do believe that the police are not our enemy. Unfortunately, they've been trained to use their guns, and that's the reason we need things like cahoots to take, most of the things that police are called to do. They've not had the training to work on. And that job and all those funds should be given to somebody else that is trained to do that kind of work.
Here is now, next one is, sure admire, from Andy Gillis to everyone, sure admire and thank you for all your nonviolent work over the decades. Just watched a very inspiring new documentary called Salvador Allende by Patricio Guzman, which is a graphic illustration of how successful nonviolence can be, at least until the CIA and the right-wingers conspire against you. And then down at the bottom, down at the bottom is a link to the, but for everyone to copy. Unfortunately, once we shut down the Zoom meeting, this chat disappears. So if anybody wants to copy the link for the forum YouTube page, it's right here. So people in the audience should do that right now rather than wait until after the Zoom meeting is over. And I believe that is all the questions that are on the chat and comments. And I don't know what to do at this point. Can I turn the meeting back over to Nathan, who's presiding?
Pamela has a question. Pamela Osgood.
Oh, okay. Does she want to just ask it direct to David?
Unmute yourself, Pamela.
It's not really a question. I just wanted to acknowledge how great this was. And I want to say that I guess I just want to make a comment that I've also used nonviolence, just on the trolley, or if I see somebody getting beaten up on the street, or when I get on the trolley, somebody's beating up somebody else, I just put my face down where they are and say, you can't do this. We don't want to see this on, we don't want to see this on our trolley, and stop it right now. And so I found out many times that, of course, they can't get off the trolley, right, until the next stop, but that people will then just run away. But then I turn and face the people on the trolley and say, we can't let this happen. We can't just sit here and let this happen on our public transportation. So I think nonviolence is something that we can use also in our city, and every day when you walk on the street in San Francisco, you see opportunities to acknowledge people as human beings and also to, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said, well said.
Thank you. And by the way, in my book, I have a section on lessons learned from 60 years of nonviolent activism. And I also have resources, including films that are really excellent, like Freedom Rider, Eyes on the Prize is being shown again on PBS,
Wonderful.
which is very, very powerful. A film called A Force More Powerful, which is the power of nonviolent movements to bring about really major societal change, is available on the International Center for Nonviolent Conflicts webpage. Just go to videos and it's all available. That's all available for free. But at any rate, if your library at the church does not have this, so that everybody could have it available, there's just many good films and books and resources. And if you want to get nonviolent training, how to do that, etc. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
Another quick message from Art, just another really good link to get to the letter by members of Congress, including Lee and Jayapal and others, asking for cuts to the US Pentagon budget, non-specific cuts. So that's another excellent one for people to copy down if they want to get more information. And somebody wanted to know, where can we find that book by David Hartsough? If Dolores has copies, but do we sell the book at the Unitarian Church book table?
Yeah, I'll leave a bunch at the unit once it opens up. There'll be some there.
What about bookstores? Is it available in bookstores?
Well, any bookstore can order it.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's PM Press, that it's based in Oakland, that published it.
What's the name of the press?
PM Press.
PM Press. Okay.
Okay.
And actually, some people are actually doing and actually starting, I think this next week, an audio version of the book.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. There's also somebody who says the Green Arcade bookstore on Market and Goff has it.
It has in the past. That'd be great.
And is there one other one? Oh, your local library. David
Yes,
Daniels.
San Francisco Library has it.
You can order it from the local library too.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for taking a chunk of your Sunday afternoon to hear some of these stories, and hopefully they've been helpful and inspiring. And it's been a joy to really be a part of this movement for the last 65 years or so. And I want to encourage everyone to, I know that probably everybody, I'm sure everybody on this call or on this Zoom is deeply concerned. And what we need to do is decide what is an issue that we really would like to focus our energy on, find some other people in our church or community, wherever we are, that will work together to really, over months and maybe years, on that issue, to build a sustained campaign, whether it's to get end of police killing, or whether it's to help support the international campaign to end landmines, which is now, by international law, nuclear weapons are illegal. And over 50 nations have signed on to that agreement. And the United States is kind of leading the charge trying to stop it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that'd be an issue. I'm just throwing that out as, I think, one very important issue. But pick what's most important to you, and then, you know, find people to really work on that in a sustained way together. the way we have in Nuremberg Actions and Witness for Peace and many other groups. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
David.
you.
Continue to inspire us. Thank you.
Yes, very, very inspiring. And